That all of you are expecting this meeting to begin. Excuse me, can I have your attention, please? Can I have your attention, please? Let's give it a few more moments. I know that we're all anticipating and expecting to begin at 10 o'clock, but we have people still signing in. So y'all continue to fellowship. I know that's not a hard and difficult thing for this group to do. And we'll begin just in a few minutes when we see the line actually zero out there. So thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here and welcome to the listening session for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds for Sally and Zeta. Before we begin with the remarks, let me ask those of you, and this brings back memories for those mayors that are in the audience. God, I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to DTs up here. Could I get a raise of hands of the elected officials, mayors first? Okay, it gives these gentlemen a read on the audience from that perspective. Could I get a raise of hands of council members in the audience? All right. Are there any county representatives? All right. So elected county officials. So grant writers. Okay. Nonprofits. Okay. So a good cross section. So Ryan, you have seen the audience that you're going to be briefing here in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to share information with you, give you the status of where we are, review the general rules and regulations of the funds, and most importantly, to hear from you about your local needs and challenges and expectations. Background on storms. It hit in fall of 2020 and caused extensive damage and destruction. Congress and the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development allocated just over $500 million to Alabama to recover. My agency, the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs, is the lead agency to administer this award. This is a team effort. I want to introduce Shabir Olia. Shabir. Also, Trent Williams from our Community Economic Development Division. ADECA has selected Horne Llp as our partner to assist with a long-term recovery project as well as Volker. We have a representative here with us today. From that perspective, we're looking at they have an extensive experience with disaster recovery. You will hear from them in just a few moments in reference to what what HUD is expecting from us and from you. We know that this has been almost 2 years since the hurricane has hit, but there is a process established by HUD that we must follow to develop our plan for these funds. We're working as diligently as we can under the process to complete the plan. Your feedback and participation in today's meeting will help us understand your needs to be proactive in answering some of your questions. Here is an estimated timeline. And might I add, and let me put the emphasis on estimated timeline. Action plan submission deadline, November the 20th, but we are aiming to turn it around well before that deadline. Local funding allocations in the next 45 days. HUD approvals of action plans, it's expected by mid-January 2023. Start signing sub-recipient agreements with local partners first quarter of 2023. Signed HUD agreements February of 2023. Initial local funding available March of 2023. HUD deadline to spend all grant funds 6 years from grant agreement date, likely February of 2029. Local funding amounts will go to counties and municipal governments. These amounts are being finalized based on a formula to the most impacted counties as identified by HUD, then to the other impacted counties on the competition-based distribution. More to come on this because we want to hear from the stakeholders to help guide the development process. Let me finish by thanking you for coming today. We look forward to the listening and talking with you. And I now want to introduce Ryan Flannery with Horne Llp. Ryan?
Thank you, Director. It's great to be here today with you all. Really quickly introduce myself. I'm Ryan Flannery. I've been with Horne for about 3 years now. I'm the Director of Cdbg Policy and Compliance with Horne. Prior to that, I was with HUD for about 10 years, where I was the Assistant Director of the Disaster Recovery Division. So I've been all in around Cdbg and Cdbg DR for roughly 14 to 15 years now. Really, the team is really bringing a breadth of experience from me from a federal perspective, and others from subrecipient perspectives, from direct grantee perspectives. And so what we're here today to do is to really present to you all what the rules are with this money, what the general kind of plan is in terms of how we're going to look to execute, and to seek your feedback. And so it's extremely important to hear from you all, to engage in a good conversation. So we look forward to hearing from you. And we're here to help answer any questions. I see us as having a role of really two key components, right, to our role. One is compliance. We're here to make sure that the money gets spent right, gets spent in a way that keeps everybody out of trouble, and can facilitate a good, strong, number two, implementation. And so we're here to help facilitate the implementation and help this recovery get off the ground. I know everybody's been waiting a long time. We're going on 2 years. It's going to take a bit longer to get this money up and running, get these programs up and running. But when we do, we're going to hit the ground running. We're going to have a solid foundation. We're going to get ready. This is the first step in that journey. So thank you all again.
Hello, I'm Steve Rawlinson, Director at Horne. I've been working at Horne for a little over about a year and a half. Previously, before that, I worked for the City of Houston. I was the CFO there, Housing Community Development Department. I've been through multiple tropical storms and hurricanes for the City of Houston. And shortly thereafter that, I worked there from 2006 to 2017. And then after that, I got an opportunity to go work for HUD for about 4 years with Secretary Carson. I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Development, and also the Federal Fiscal Monitor overseeing funds in Puerto Rico.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adrian Celestine. I've worked in disaster recovery for about 15 years. The last 3 I've been with Horne as a director helping with disaster recovery projects. Prior to that, I was with the state of Louisiana for 12 years, working in several capacities, mainly as director of their recovery programs, overseeing infrastructure, economic development, multifamily housing, the team there. So that's me.
Good morning, everybody. Horne Llp. I've been with Horne just over a year, but I've been in disaster recovery dating back to some recovery planning after Hurricane Katrina. I was director of the multifamily storm recovery program for the city of New York. And since then, I've been a consultant assisting states on statewide housing recovery programs spanning from New Jersey all the way down to Louisiana and Florida as well, in addition to Puerto Rico. So I'm Horne's lead on housing policy and compliance. So again, thank you all.
All right, and I guess now we're going to move into the presentation. All right, great.
Sorry. Hello, can y'all hear me? Okay, awesome. First, I just want to start by saying thank you for showing up today. It shows your commitment to long-term disaster recovery. And to be honest with you, I'm honored to be here and help you through this process. When I was working for the city of Houston, we'd get direct allocations from HUD. One of the most frustrating things that we had to deal with was why it took so long for the funds to get to the local level. And what I want to do is take you through that process from when funds come from DC to Alabama to ADECA and then finally to you. And hopefully, once I walk you through this process, you'll have a good understanding of the timeline and what it takes to get funding to the local levels. So I'll start out just talking a little bit about Hurricane Sally. You're all too familiar with this, so I won't spend too much time on it. But Hurricane Sally made landfall in September of 2020. And what I want you to do is really, really focus on that date, because I'm going to take you through the timeline up to where we are today and where we're going in the future. So Hurricane Sally, it produced widespread wind, storm damage. It was directly related to 3 deaths. You had almost 300,000 people without electrical power. And what usually happens at this stage is FEMA is first on the ground, and they're giving emergency services, temporary housing, food, water, just trying to get Alabama back on its feet. And Alabama wasn't so lucky, because shortly after that, Hurricane Zeta, did I say that right, Zeta? Or I've heard some people say Zeta? Okay, just want to make sure I was saying it right. 5 weeks after that, you guys end up going through the process all over again, and you have almost $1 billion in damage and over 400,000 people without electricity. So the process to get funds to Alabama starts with Congress. Department of Housing, they do the allocation, but before they get the allocation, you have to have funds appropriated. Congress first appropriated funds for long-term disaster recovery in 1992 for Hurricane Andrew, and the program has never had permanent statutory authority, so there's no annual appropriation and no federal regulations tied to that like you have with your regular CDBG, home, HOPWA, and ESG grants. So every time a storm occurs, you've got to go through this long, arduous process, and I'm going to step you through that now. So funding starts with the president declaring a natural disaster, and that can happen sometimes right before the storm, during the storm, or after the storm, and then Congress appropriates funds. Congress appropriated funds on September 30th, 2021, one whole year after the storm hit. So I'm focusing on this because it's long-term recovery, and it's built into the process to where I'm about to take you, which is almost where we're at now. So HUD calculates the individual allocations. It's not just for Alabama, it's for Mississippi. It's possibly 8 to 10 other states. And that's the first step in the process. And then they come out with a Federal Register notice. That Federal Register notice came down in February of 2022. And then we got the first allocation. And then after that, you got another allocation in May. So that brings us almost to where we're at today, which is wanting to listen to you. Today is a listening session, and this listening session is not something that HUD said we have to do. This is something the state of Alabama and ADECA wants to do. So we're involving you in the process right now, and we're at the point where we're putting together the action plan. And inside that action plan, you know, you have unmet needs assessment, you conduct outreach activities, and this is basically the first step in the process, and that's where we're at today. After we have a couple public hearings throughout the community, maybe 3 of them, plus this listening session, then we'll gather all of your comments and try to respond to them, you know, the best we can, and then we'll have an action plan. That action plan, as Director Boswell was stating earlier, is due November 30th. We're going to do everything we can to get the action plan out sooner. Once HUD receives the action plan, they have 60 days to approve that action plan. And working at HUD for 4 years, it takes almost all 60 days. It's not just one allocation to Alabama. They're working with several states. So that puts us to sometime in January before we have an approved action plan. Before we have, an approved action plan. And then you have to have a grant agreement. So we think that the funds will be here sometime around February, March, or April of 2023. And I'm going to take you through this timeline really quick because it's important. It's important for everybody to truly understand that Alabama does not have the funds right now. So if you have some frustration, it's not Alabama's fault. It's just the process that happens at the federal government. So I mentioned some of these dates, but I'll take you through this timeline. Hurricane Sally made landfall September 20th, 2020. Shortly thereafter, Hurricane Zeta made landfall 5 weeks later. 1 year later, after that, Congress appropriates funds. Okay? And then HUD puts out 2 Federal Register notices, one in February and one in May. And that brings us almost to where we're at right now. So right now we're starting the whole consolidated action plan, but you know, Alabama and ADECA have been working really hard before the action plan because they have to do certifications. They have to do a financial and grant certification, which is pretty extensive. You have to put together an implementation plan, a staffing plan, how you're going to, you know, put these funds out. It's a really big process. And then on your certifications, you got to have processes and procedures in place for website requirements. The reason I mention this is because HUD is they're working toward transparency, and all procurements and contracts must be posted on the website. And part of that process is talking about how frequently you're going to update that website. So there's total transparency with these funds. You have duplications of benefit policies and procedures. I won't get too much into that because we're going to talk about it in this presentation. Timely expenditures, conflicts of interest, anti-fraud, waste, and abuse policy. So there's a lot happening right now. And we're at this phase right now to where we're starting this first listening session, but we still have some work to do. We're going to have public hearings starting in September of 2022. We're going to have public comments. I talked a little bit about that. We're going to have to Once we receive all those comments, we'll try to respond to all of them the best we can. And then the action plan is due in November. After that action plan is due, you're waiting about 60 days for approval from HUD. And then after that, you still have to enter into a grant agreement, which usually takes another 45 to 50 days. So that's why we believe that the funds will be here sometime around February or March. It's the process that we have to go through. And what I just want to say is just remember that it's long-term recovery. It's not FEMA coming in right after the disaster. And what we want to do is just get your input so that we can have a great program, help as many people as we can, and rebuild Alabama. So I'll go a little bit into the CDBG requirements. I won't go too deep because I don't want to steal Adrian's thunder. She's right here next to me. But some of the components of an eligible project are actually you have to meet a national objective, you have to have an eligible activity, and you have to have tie back to the storm. And you need all three of these components to have an eligible project. So what are the national objectives? There are three national objectives. The first one is we have to benefit low to moderate income persons, urgent need, or aid in prevention of slum and blight. So those are the three national objectives, and up under each one of them is some subcategories we can talk about later today. Some of the eligible activities. Here's a list of eligible activities. I will not go too deep into it, but some of the activities that are really important in disaster recovery is like construction of housing, public facilities and improvements, acquisition, public services, relocation, and you can see there's a whole list of them. And if you want to dive deeper into each one of these later, which I think Adrian will do, please ask questions. We can definitely answer those questions, but just wanted to give you just an overview of some of the activities. Now, what's also important is the tie back to the disaster. You know, Alabama is receiving $500 million, and part of receiving HUD funding is to have a tie back to the disaster. And some of the ways that you can do this is through like your insurance claims, but each house, each component, every activity that we touch, we have to document in the file how this was either directly or indirectly affected by the storm. The duplication of benefits. Federal requirements is that I mentioned earlier about having a policy for duplication of benefits. Duplication of benefits is a little tricky, and it takes some work to get this all figured out. You have to have policies and procedures, not only for when you're getting funding, but after funding has been received. And I'll explain some of that shortly. But you know, if you receive FEMA funds for replacing the roof, you can't receive HUD funds for the same type of service. So we have to document anything that you received, whether it's from insurance proceeds, FEMA, SBA, so on and so forth. And then you have to document how long you're going to monitor that, because you could have an insurance claim, but you receive disaster assistance, but you're in some type of litigation with your insurance company, and you receive, and let's say you receive a payout, you know, 3 months after HUD's finished their repairs. You have to pay those funds back because that would be considered a DOB. So you have to put policies and procedures in place for how long you look at this stuff even after you receive assistance. So I will now turn it over to Adrian, but before I do, I just want to thank you, truly thank you for being here. We really want your input, and we're looking forward to speaking to you today. Thank you.
Turn my mic on. Taking over from Steve and kind of reiterating some of what he said, in order to have an eligible project, there are, you know, the three major components that Steve talked about. It has to meet a national objective, an eligible activity, but most importantly, it needs to tie to the storm. There are many different types of projects that can be eligible. I mean, pretty, a lot. There are many, many things. What HUD specifically, HUD specifically names 3 categories that are the primary sectors that people or grantees decide to invest CDBG disaster recovery funds in. And again, that ties to the unmet needs assessment that is done during the action plan process that Sean will talk about later. But by and large, these are the 3 major categories that you'll see. I'll talk about some others as well, but let's start with housing. Housing is by far the #1 type of program or project that grantees decide to undertake. Typically, it ties to what comes out of the unmet needs assessment as the most critical need, with homeowner rehabilitation programs absolutely being the #1 activity that's undertaken after a disaster. That's typically what most residents are looking for to rebuild and get back into their homes. In addition to that, you may see some buyout and acquisition programs that also may tie to mitigation funding to move folks out of harm's way. Public housing rehabilitation, which HUD specifically calls out in the Federal Register notice as something they want the grantees to pay attention to and to address and look into whether or not there is an unmet need there that needs to be addressed. Another common type of program is preserving existing affordable homes, whether it be rental or homeownership, as well as developing new single-family and multifamily homes, which is allowed under the regulations through a waiver in the Federal Register notice. A lot of grantees also decide to do infrastructure-type projects. As you all may know, FEMA requires a 10 to 25% match for HMGP and PA projects at the local level. These funds can be used to meet that match requirement. So that's very attractive to a lot of local governments who may find it hard to come up with the funding after a disaster to meet that match requirement. A lot of grantees also engage in repairing roads, streets, bridges that were damaged after a storm, improving their sewer and stormwater facilities. They also are allowed to invest in the rehab of public facilities. Again, as Steve talked about, you need to think about what that duplication of benefits might be if there are costs that FEMA covers. HUD funding, CDBG DR funding is the funding of last resort. So if there are costs that are covered by FEMA, but say you want to make enhancements to a community center or fire station, you can absolutely use CDBG DR funding to cover those additional costs. You can also improve park and recreational facilities. I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of details and examples, but feel free to ask questions after about what is allowed and disallowed, and I'll talk about some of that a little later as well. Economic revitalization is kind of my baby. It's the thing that I started off in disaster recovery working. There are a number of activities you can do under economic revitalization. Most grantees want to provide some assistance to their small business community in particular, whether it be through direct grants for rebuilding after a storm or providing technical assistance to help them regroup or readapt their business model after a changed environment after a hurricane. Those are very common. You can also do facade and streetscape improvement programs to enhance the revitalization of a particular corridor or a particular community. A lot of grantees also engage in infrastructure in support of economic development, which means you can help build a road for a new business that's coming in or improve the sidewalks to support business development. Small business incubators are pretty common as well as workforce training programs. Workforce training programs are common. They can be general workforce training programs, or they can be specific to certain industries that the community has identified as needed in the community, needing a larger workforce in those particular industries. Other activities. So in addition to the 3 primary sectors, a lot of grantees decide or use some of their funding for planning and public service activities, creating mitigation, risk plans, land use plans, building the capacity of their planning department after a storm to help assist with all these plans and help the local communities. You can also enhance public services for enhanced, exacerbated need after a storm. You know, there's always a bigger need for daycare centers. You may have had daycare centers that were damaged that never reopened, so you need help enhancing that sector. So you can do that. You can enhance senior centers, provide additional mental health services that may be needed after a storm, in addition to increasing your assistance to homeless shelters and providing additional homeless support services. Code inspections and enforcements are also a big area. It's not usually very costly to do that, but after a lot of homes in the community and businesses in the community have been damaged after a storm, many communities find the need to enhance their code inspection departments and build up the capacity there, at least on a temporary basis. Mitigation. Some of you may know that the Federal Register notice specified that 15% of the allocation must go towards mitigation expenses. These mitigation projects can be standalone projects and completely different from the disaster recovery projects that are chosen, or they can be used to enhance projects that are disaster recovery projects. So, for example, you can elevate homes. That could be in conjunction with an existing disaster recovery housing program, or it could be a standalone elevation project. You can do flood drive retrofits, buyout and relocations could be considered a mitigation activity as well. Hardening critical infrastructure and providing resiliency programs for energy and water efficiency. So we talked about what's eligible. Let's cover a couple of things that are specifically ineligible. So there are a lot of things that HUD says are ineligible, but these are a few that we thought we should point out to you guys so you're clear on, you know, some of the things that the community may rightfully need or want, but that's specifically prohibited in the regulations or in the Federal Register notice. Income payments. You cannot make direct cash payments that are not specifically tied to a use of funds. Every dollar that's spent with CDBG funds must tie to a very specific eligible use. So just handing out checks to homeowners or businesses or anyone is specifically prohibited. You also can't cover the cost of forced mortgage payoffs, which a lot of homeowners unfortunately face after a disaster when their home is damaged, but is not eligible per CDBG regs. The Federal Register notice specifically prohibits assistance to private utility companies. So just that's specifically spelled out in this particular Federal Register notice. Political and lobbying activities are prohibited. No lobbying, no advertising that includes elected officials. That's specifically prohibited as well. You can't fund buildings for the general conduct of government, which kind of could be a bit nuanced and tricky. You know, you think about, well, a park is a, public facility. So we're not talking about public facilities. We're talking about city halls where your government business is conducted. Those are prohibited from being assisted with disaster recovery funds. And general government expenses. We can't cover the cost of your general operations of government using disaster recovery funds. Sean is going to take over now and talk through how we come up with what the unmet needs of the community is, how that ties to the action plan and the decisions that we'll make as far as the different allocations that are made with these disaster recovery funds. That action plan is being developed as we speak. The unmet needs assessment is being completed, and Sean will take us through what that process looks like and how it all ties to the ultimate allocation of funding.
Thanks, Adrian. I am going to attempt to take hundreds and hundreds of pages of technical documentation and distill it into digestible pieces. So if you have more questions on any of these topics, please let me know. As Adrian mentioned, there are remaining unmet needs after every single disaster. And essentially what an unmet need is, it's the outcome of an analysis where we look at what the damages were, those estimates after the storm. We compare that to what kind of funding was available to come in and help recovery after the storm and rebuild. And what that difference is, what insurance or FEMA or SBA did not cover, we call the unmet need. That's a very simplistic definition of it, but it's important to know because, as Adrian mentioned before, the HUD funding is really funding of last resort, and the funds really need to go to addressing what other forms of benefits did not cover. So in this image, we will look at FEMA, individual assistance, and public assistance data, as well as SBA and other sources like insurance. We'll assess the damages through damage assessments, impact assessments from localities, counties, federal and state agencies as well. And in this graphic, the globes illustrate the amount of damage that some of these sectors may have faced: housing, infrastructure, and the economy. The colored liquids within these globes illustrate the amount of funding that came in. And according to this example, you can see that transportation and the local economy, right there, had a lot of damage, but also a lot of funding actually came in to help that recovery. You'll notice under housing for, say, owner-occupied, over here, not a lot of funding came in to help recover. So that difference is that unmet need. And this is really important information for the state to obtain because we will use this information to help guide and inform how we're going to disperse the funding across the various sectors, from housing, infrastructure, to the economy. Again, since it is HUD funding, there is a heavy emphasis on housing recovery. So we're going to take all that information, all this analysis, and help inform the development of our disaster recovery action plan. It's a HUD requirement for the state to take under to inform how we're going to use the funds, how we're going to disperse the funds across these sectors. Again, this action plan includes an impact and needs assessment, assessing what the storm did, how much need is remaining, and what we're going to do with the funds. And again, it goes into housing, infrastructure, and the economy. Got to align it with these limited resources. $500 million seems like a lot of money, but when you look at the impacted areas, it goes pretty quick. So we need to align those limited resources for the type of recovery we need and align it with the community needs. And then again, in the action plan, we need to illustrate that our budget allocations are aligned with what we concluded in the needs assessment. The funding needs to promote sound long-term recovery, and also specifically for economic revitalization, really needs to be targeted to underserved communities that were distressed prior to the disaster. And again, housing is a priority. I keep reemphasizing that because the funds really do need to serve that purpose. Throughout this action plan development process, the state will engage other public and affordable housing partners in the state and in the local communities to really find and assess what the impacts were to those specific communities and also those vulnerable populations as well. Another major component to these action plans that the state must address is fair housing and equal opportunity provisions. Now, there's a lot of information that goes into this. I'm going to go through it very quickly, but if there's any questions specific to this, happy to answer those questions after this meeting. But the grantee must assess any unjustified discriminatory effects on racial and ethnic minorities. You must identify benefits to these protected classes. You need to explain how the use of these funds will reduce barriers of enrollment to these programs that are going to get funded with DR funds and access. the state needs to demonstrate the actions that they're going to take to further fair housing, provide examples of how the allocations and the programs will advance equity. They include equitable benefit to protected classes, investment into communities that were once disinvested in. They also need to identify the proximity of some of these protected classes to natural and environmental hazards in close proximity. Then again, describe how the use of funds will be consistent with their fair housing obligations. So, as my colleagues previously said, the state was allocated just over $500 million in DR funding. $435 million of that, about 85%, will have to go directly to any remaining unmet needs from the storms, and 15% will be dedicated to mitigation activities. ADECA is the lead agency developing the action plan and the unmet needs assessment. Now, the most impacted areas identified by HUD and accepted by the state include the counties of Baldwin, Clark, Escambia, and Mobile. So what that means in terms of funding, per the requirements, is that the state has to spend at least 80% of all the funds in those 4 counties. So that amounts to about just over $400 million that will be spent in those 4 counties alone. The remaining will be spent in the other impacted counties. So we've downloaded a lot of data from FEMA, SBA, and other sources. I've done a quick preliminary unmet needs snapshot just to sort of illustrate where we're at using a lot of the HUD data as well. And right now, the needs are pointing in the direction of housing being one of the greatest unmet needs as of right now, followed by infrastructure at about 10% of the need and the economy at about 5%. I just want to reiterate, this is a preliminary snapshot. As we get more data in and analyze it, we will have a better idea of where this distribution will ultimately land us and help guide the action plan. So the method of distribution is a process that a grantee undertakes to disperse the funds down to the local level. There's a lot of ways that a grantee can disperse the funds, but HUD's primary interest is that it's, one, well documented so that the localities have a clear understanding of how the funds are actually getting dispersed, and 2, to ensure that the funds are dispersed in a fair and equitable approach. So there's a few different ways that this can be structured, and the state is currently considering all of the options on the table, but there could be a state-managed sort of direct implementation from the state. There could be a local distribution down to counties and localities as well, or there could be a hybrid model where the state runs parts of the programs and localities also run parts of programs as well. Again, this is going to be formula-based and or based on a competition as well. So the current considerations right now is that for the mid-counties, those most impacted counties that I just mentioned, it will be a formula-based allocation. And a few variables the state's considering right now in determining that proportion would be remaining unmet needs in those communities, vulnerable populations or social vulnerability of those areas, and also the size of the population in the impacted areas. For the remainder of the non-mid counties, the non-most impacted and distressed, it will be considered for a competition-based allocation, where those localities can identify projects, put together applications, and submit them for review, as long as they're based on an eligible activity and they're specifically calling out a project that they would like to get funded to recover from these 2 hurricanes. In the case that there are local distributions of the funds down to localities, there are several key preparations that localities should consider prior to receiving any of these funds. The anticipation of a subrecipient capacity and risk assessment to ensure that you have the capacity, staffing, financial controls, policies and procedures, et cetera. An implementation plan that documents all of the capacities that you have for like information technology against staffing. But if staffing is a concern, procurement of goods and services is also going to be a consideration that you'll have to undertake. And there are a lot of rules and regs around procurement. I'm not going to get into all of them today, but procurement will have to take place, certainly if you all want to hire contractors to help support the local effort. Identify technical assistance questions that you may need some training from the state. Engaging in outreach and community engagement to localities. Developing a more localized needs assessment to really hone in on some local specific needs, and also identification of some of the most vulnerable populations in your community that will benefit from these funds. And also fair housing and equal opportunity considerations across the board will need to be considered for every aspect of managing these funds as well. So we, as Steve mentioned, we're going to have 3 more public hearings coming up. 2 are going to take place the week of September 11th, one in Baldwin County, one back here in Mobile County, and the 3rd has not yet been scheduled. So these 2 are going to happen before the action plan is published for public comment, so that we can get some feedback and hear from you and understand the needs and the desires that y'all might have. And then once we publish the action plan, we'll host one final public hearing and incorporate those comments that we receive. So the next steps for ADECA right now, we're going to continue our outreach and our community engagement, complete the unmet needs and mitigation assessments. We're going to finalize the program design for the programs that are going to get funded, finalize that method of distribution, as I just mentioned, publish and finalize the action plan, post it for public comment, and then submit it to HUD for approval. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Really appreciate that, that thorough presentation. I know it was a lot of information. Obviously, there are going to be more questions that are going to come from you all, and we look forward to those questions. You know, again, we're here to help support this all the way through. So we're here to help answer questions. We're here to help support not only ADECA, but also at the local level. So again, we look forward to working with all of you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Director Boswell.
Thank you, Ryan. Ladies and gentlemen, let me issue some brief instructions. We would ask that we now move to the most important part of the session, that's the listening and hearing from you. We have a limited amount of time, so I want to go over a few guidelines to ensure that the most smooth as possible, that we do this as most easiest way that we can to give everyone a fair chance. We have a staff member with microphones. Hold your hand up, Russell. He's over your shoulder. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand, and the staff member will come to your row. Please step up or step into the aisle to the staff member will hold the mic while you talk or direct you down to the podium to speak. If you have a physical condition that prevents you from being able to move from your seat to the aisle, let us know and we'll make accommodations to get the mic to you. Please keep remarks or questions to 3 minutes maximum as you can, because we may have other people that wants to ask questions, and we hope to be finished by noon. So let's begin. Are there any questions at this particular point? Russell, come on down.
Troy Strunk with the City of Daphne, Alabama. Director Boswell, we appreciate you coming.
Yes,
I apologize, Mayor Lejeune couldn't be here today. He's going through some personal health issues and was unable to attend.
I understand.
The City of Daphne did, excuse me. Well, now I lost it. So the City of Daphne did receive extensive storm damage from Hurricane Sally and Hurricane Zeta, specifically in power lines and stormwater problems. The City of Daphne, many parts of it, including low income and moderate income housing areas, including Lake Forest, one of the largest subdivisions in the city in the state, was out of power for 7 to 9 days, including with the extensive flooding from the rise of the high tide at the Mobile Bay and the amazing amounts of rain that we received in the City of Daphne created a number of flooding issues for us. So the city of Daphne certainly experienced some major problems from these hurricanes, and we look forward to seeing where we can go with the funding. Thank you.
Morning, and also Director Boswell and team. We appreciate you offering us this opportunity. I'm Sheldon Day, Mayor of Thomasville. Although we're 100 miles north of here, Zeta came within the eye of Zeta on the southeast quadrant, came within 2 miles of my city. And if you watch the track and the intensity of the storm, it stayed very strong through our area. So we received a significant damage. Clark County in particular is a distressed county overall. And quite rural. So we would like for you to, one thing that I always I'm concerned about when we start talking about a pro rata share and start looking at pro rata or population sizes, so many times our rural areas get disenfranchised or neglected because our population, although we don't have the population, Clark County is the 3rd largest land area county in the state of Alabama. And so we have many more miles of roads, many more miles of infrastructure and other things that need to be repaired. So I just ask that when you look at your criteria, that you'll strongly consider making sure that the rural areas aren't disenfranchised and that we have an equal opportunity to work with you guys and coming up with a fair and equitable formula. Also, a lot of the data, just want to remind you guys that the data you might have gotten from FEMA was inadequate. Keep in mind, we're going through a pandemic. We did not have any representatives coming to our communities, doing the inspections, taking any pictures and doing anything. They were all doing it remotely. And that's one reason we're having a hard time now, even getting the FEMA dollars that it's 2 years later and we're still fighting over those FEMA dollars. You know, a lot of the data that you have is probably from the FEMA side, if anything, is insufficient and incomplete. So I just want to make sure of that. Thank you so much.
I'm Ron Mitchell with the Saraland Water and Sewer Service. The Saraland Water and Sewer provides water distribution and sewer collection for the city of Saraland. The sewer system is impacted during storms, especially when extremely high tides and wind back water up into Bayou Sara, coupled with the runoff from rain events upstream. The upstream and downstream water that converge, flooding Saraland's low-lying areas, resulted in lift station failures and sewage backups in our low to moderate income communities. That's threatening health and safety for our vulnerable population. Over 25% of Saraland's land area is located in FEMA's 100-year flood zone. The sewer system needs to construct infrastructure in the low to moderate income areas to be more resilient to storm events, such as upgraded lift stations, cured in place pipe, generators for lift stations, and improvements at the wastewater treatment facility to handle increased flows from storms. During Hurricane Sally, we were without power for almost 4 days, resulting in several sanitary sewer overflows in residential areas. We believe the CDBG disaster funds will help us address these critical infrastructure needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Beth Biggs. I'm from Baldwin County. My first role is, I want to say, I, by choice, live on Perdido Bay. And we were right after Gulf Shores in the little town of Perdido Beach, directly affected by the storm, by Sally. I vacated, so I can't say I lived through it, but my husband and my dog stayed there. And the bay was under our house for 7 days. So we have a real issue with storm drainage, and I'm hoping that possibly these funds will help some of our smaller communities like ours that don't have a lot of income to do those repairs. But anyway, so I'm hoping that'll be on the radar. Secondly, my role is a director of a nonprofit organization called Family Promise of Baldwin County, and we serve homeless families with children. And I just wanted to speak directly to, because I don't know about the data about the number of families that were affected by being vacated from rental properties that were damaged from Sally, because that's something we started experiencing 1 month after Sally hit. My staff and I reported to the Volunteer Registration Resource Center that our VOAD organized, and we worked from that station in Robertsdale along with the EMA for 3 weeks, 21 days solid. We worked 7 days a week. And that's where we saw the families that were coming to us who were getting vacate notices from their landlords. A lot of those apartments that were vacated were our lower income houses, and I'm just going to say this dollar, under $1,000 a month. Those units were vacated, and when they came back on the market, are now asking $400 and $600 more per month for housing. So we have a real need for affordable housing. When we became aware of the families with children that were vacated in rental units, and I only knew this because of the work we did at the Volunteer Reception Center and working closely with EMA, we identified 128 families with children. And of those 128 families with children, 58 of them did not self-resolve. And the others were able to figure out what their next steps were, where they were going to move, et cetera. And of those 58, we ended up sheltering 28 of those families. And some of those families are still struggling, a handful. We work very hard to help them, but they are the families that work in our service industry, our tourism, hospitality industry, our healthcare industry. All of the families we serve are working families. We're hoping, I personally am hoping, that this money can be used to help with some of that affordable housing lack that we have. And for those of us who are homeowners in Baldwin County, we're very, it's great that our values of our homes are going up and maybe our taxes get affected, but the reality of those who care for us as we get older, those who care for our tourism and hospitality industry, are those who are suffering. Where can they live and be able to work here? So, and Baldwin County is not ignorant to this. Our chambers of commerce understand affordable housing to be one of the top 2 needs that our chambers look at every year, and it's workforce housing. I don't even like to use the word affordable housing. I like to use workforce housing because everybody's working. And fortunately, we live in a place where people can work. But I will say this, one of the families that just graduated from our program 2 weeks ago was one of the fatalities. Her husband died after Sally when a tree fell on him when he was trying to remove it from his house. She, as the widow, and their 2 children came to us and had to figure out life all over. Number one, she had to figure out what does it mean to be a widow, and then to find housing on 1 income. And it's taken her a long time. So Sally was, more than 2 years ago, or it will be 2 years in September? It's taken her that long to figure it out. So we have some real stories. I happened to go by the American Legion Hall, and I guess this is a question. The American Legion on Mobile Bay, they still have blue tarps. Would an organization like that be available, to be able to be helped with this, with those repairs? I don't know. I know we talk about homes in this. So I have a lot of questions. So
let me start by saying, so the impact on renters, and especially low mod income renters, and especially the extremely low income renters, is a data point that's very difficult to get, right? It's very difficult for us to assess assess the impact and attribute a dollar value. So I ask you and anybody else who works in this area, any data that you have on the number of families that you've worked with, anything that could help support our unmet needs analysis, to incorporate that into the unmet needs analysis and then ultimately into the distribution of funds, would be very helpful. So Maybe that's something that we could talk a little bit more about. In terms of your specific questions, I could say, obviously the needs of renters is extremely important to HUD. And so they do put that into the Federal Register notice that we have to look at that, assess the impact, and ultimately provide support, right? And understanding what their role in the economy and in the local communities typically is extremely important. So it's something that we've been talking about internally, how best to assess that and how best to demonstrate that in the action plan. In terms of your question about the American Legion, I believe they're a nonprofit organization, right? So if they are, then they technically are eligible for funding under 105.8.14, if I recall. Anyway, it's a specific regulation within the HUD regs that allows you to assist nonprofit organizations. That all gets, I think, put into a larger bucket of, infrastructure, public facilities, and so on.
Substance abuse prevention. Also, we deal with conflict resolution. We also deal with character development. So we deal with many families, and the storm came up that rearranged a lot of our activities. So we was unable to do those kinds of services for those communities. So how do we address those issues? How do those issues fit into this program that you have? I'm also a homeowner, Mobile, Alabama. My name is Makinde Bolahan. And I had to remove some trees and stuff as well from my house. And the insurance company wouldn't give me insurance till I moved all the trees and stuff. Then I lost the roof and some other things. So this information here would also be applicable to what y'all trying to accomplish?
So, yes. To start, in terms of nonprofits and social services that are provided, they are typically eligible, right? That you can provide assistance with CDBG to supplement social services. It's called under an activity category or an eligible activity type called public services. The questions that I would have would be, again, in general, what we're looking for is, in particular, what were the impacts, right? So was there damage to the facility that you operate in? Was there an impact that reduced the number of staff, for example, that work with you? What was the impact from the event ultimately? And you don't have to answer this right now. It's just in general, I'm putting it out there, the types of questions that we would ask in order to determine assistance in the long run. And this is down the road because each individual project is not where we're at right now. We're at how do we collect as much information about what the need is and then allocate resources in terms of funding in a proportional amount that then ultimately can go down to support public services like the one you provide. In terms of your house, this is something I'd also put out there for others, those of you who work in government or have are in positions, in elected positions and so on, who know your constituents. And we have some questions that we're going to hopefully get to a little bit of a guided Q&A shortly. But to the extent that you understand, because you're there on the ground with them, you understand what their needs are, what has been provided. So, for example, you've done work, you've removed a tree from your house. I don't know if you've repaired your roof yet.
Yeah.
You've done things like that. Is that the case with most or many of the folks that live in your communities? Have they been able to recover on their own, either with their own funds or with other funds? Have they not? So do we have a significant number of households that are still not repaired? Do we have blue roofs? Do we have blue tarps on the roofs? Do we have unaddressed flooding damage, mold in homes? Those types of things. Have those types of things been addressed? If not, that's where our remaining unmet need is. Now, there are other potential opportunities for addressing those folks who have been able to do repairs on their own, but that again is also a little bit down the road. So we're collecting information and understanding as best we can what's it look like on the ground right now, right? That's what we're looking for. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, Marina Simpson, United Way of Baldwin County. I would like to echo everything that Beth said. We saw that all at United Way of Baldwin County. In addition, we ran a Hurricane Sally Rebuild Fund at our office. We were also the fiscal agent for the long-term recovery for Baldwin County, as well as the Governor's Emergency Relief Fund. We are glad to help you guys in any way to assess the current unmet needs. What we are seeing now with our unmet needs are individuals who, if we came around them and were able to address their issues, it would still be a drop in the bucket for what they really need to rehabilitate their home. So there are unmet needs still in Baldwin County as a result of Sally, and we are glad to help assess that for you guys.
Appreciate that. One point I also want to make, just to make sure that we all understand how important this is. To the extent that there's damage that remains, to the extent that there are needs that are still out there, HUD, nothing is real to HUD unless it's documented. And when I say documented, I mean you have some kind of paper documentation, something that you can show them that supports the claims that are being made, right? So to the extent that, for example, homes still need to be repaired, ultimately we're going to have to go out and do inspections. We're going to have to look at those homes. We're going to inspect them and determine what the damage was from the event, if there are other needs to be addressed, and so on and so forth. To the extent there are impacts to public services that we're going to ultimately address, we have to look at what were those impacts. Who can they no longer? Who did they have to let go? Particularly like public service providers and so on. What is the impacts on the financials in terms of we were generating this much revenue, now we don't have that much. Those are all things that are extremely important to consider. So when you're thinking about what can you do, and we talked about preparations, document everything, save everything, receipts, information, letters, emails, communications, whatever you can keep everything, because without it, we may not be able to address those issues.
Speaking to your directly to what you talked about, tree removal, receipts. You've got receipts where you paid a service to remove those trees. That would be very important to have. Okay. Yes.
Yes, Albert Turner from Perry County, Alabama. We are going to be in that 20% group. I hope the state looks very closely at, excuse me, allowing community centers to be one of the top priorities in this allocation of money, because although we were not directly hit, we was impacted with flood and rainwater, where we had people that were homeless and we had nowhere to house those individuals. We had to do the best we could living in the basement of the courthouse and whatnot. So we need a lot of rural communities need community centers so that they could use those during these periods of times for shelter.
Good morning. I'm Jimmy Gardner. I'm the mayor of the city of Pritchard. And first off, I'd just like to thank you for this engagement in this region. It goes without question. This is very, very important. And once again, thank you for being here, and with all our other colleagues who are here to get some clarity and understanding to what's being offered in this process. But my question would be to you is that following these major storms, oftentimes we immediately see what we see, and we take those pictures, we identify those things, of course, and we record those. But oftentimes the impact of any of these storms, you don't see the stress of the storm until later. Whether we talk about stormwater drain, even to property, be it public, private, or governmental property, we don't see it till much, much later. You don't see the impact it may have had on just sidewalks in which we walk on every day, but it had an impact on it. And so I would want to know, as we go back and assess and reassess these things, to whether or not there be some coverage or some engagement as it relates to those things that we didn't see immediately that has a significant later impact. For instance, at many of the parks, for instance, and structure that was there, you didn't see it then, But certainly you can tell that something occurred there later. And you know how that unsight, unseen, after you remove things, you see other things that may have been caused by that. And I don't have to talk about the areas that were stressed from the flood areas and those kind of things as well. So I want to just make sure that these are part of this consideration in what we're doing as it relates to what's being offered up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. It's a great point, and it's something that we've seen, for a long time now in working in these types of events. And, where we're at right now is trying to use the information that we have to determine the unmet needs, determine at a high level what the allocations will be. The way that these programs typically work is once you receive an allocation, it's then on the local governments to determine where it goes in terms of if you have a particular need in sidewalks and that you didn't identify before. We received $500 million from HUD, roughly. That has to be divided up over a fairly large geographic area. So we're going to use the data that we have to be able to focus it in where we understand the data shows it to go, mainly because that's what HUD expects to see from us. All the information that we can get from you all, though, anything that you can provide to us to help us understand what the needs are, help guide us in those directions where we can try to obtain as much information as possible to be able to incorporate it into the overall, again, unmet needs assessment and then ultimately the method distribution allocation methodology. So appreciate that. It's certainly something we've been considering, but we'd like to hear from you all the specifics as much as we can because it helps us develop the plan. And the narrative is helpful too in terms of sharing it with HUD when we make decisions about how funding is going to go out and what it's going to be used for. And so, again, appreciate that. And it is fundable, so it's eligible generally speaking.
And it's my understanding that we do have a public hearing scheduled for Pritchett.
Correct.
Anyone else?
Ken Knox with the City of Mobile. In past DR allocations, the state through AHFA has allocated more tax credit awards in the counties that are affected by disasters. I was just wondering if y'all in your action plan are giving any consideration to coordinating with them on that.
I can. That's a great point. I know that we're considering affordable housing and from multiple types of affordable housing in terms of single family all the way to multifamily and what some grantees call piggyback activities where you combine Cdbg GTR with LIHTC. In terms of requesting additional tax credits, I'd have to defer to the director and others at the Deca. It's a good point, and I think something we should certainly consider if that's an option. We'd have to work with HFA on that.
Yeah, that's something we'll most certainly look into from that perspective, but as far as a decision being made at this particular point, there has not been a decision. Anyone else? Yes, right here in the center. Russell, if you'll come out to the center of the aisle, please.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Ross from the city of Chickasaw. We are a very low-income city, and our utility department, same as the gentleman from Saraland, our infrastructure is in dire need. We were affected quite badly by Sally and Zeta. All around the city, different departments were done, and we've had to do major repair. But the thing that is in most need and the most money is our sewer department, our baffles and our pump stations and lift stations. They are in dire need, and I know we filed some claims, but we still need additional funds. And so I'm not sure what all we've got people here that we're going to try and give you as much information as we need. But if you can direct us to something else we need to do, we'll gladly do it. But thank you.
Right here, Russell.
Hi, I'm Miranda Turner from Daphne Utilities. We are a part of the city of Daphne, but we have a separate board that governs our activities. I'm here today with Scott Polk, our general manager. Going to echo what she said and what the gentleman from the city of Saraland said. Wastewater treatment is an issue when you lose power It doesn't go anywhere. It backs up. It spills out into Mobile Bay, into your local waterways, and into your residences. We've applied for other funds, haven't received them, but we're looking at different ways to eliminate these threats of SSOs. We're looking into bypass pumps at each station and, of course, generators. That is our huge need. We also have a wastewater treatment plant that is located in a FEMA-designated flood zone. So we are looking at elevating our main control building there so that it will be out of the floodplain and we'll not have to worry about it flooding or replacing equipment. Anything that has to do with wastewater is expensive. The funds are hard to come by. We are working on our own to replace some of these, but just like they said, the generators, and we're also going to try and use bypass pumps. We have 78 lift stations. Over 20 of them are located along Mobile Bay in residential areas and close to that valuable waterway that we don't want damaged. But yeah, anything we can get help with when it comes to the sewer infrastructure would be wonderful. Thank you.
Here, Russ. He's coming to you.
Fred Renfrey, Downtown Mobile Alliance. I guess I've got two ideas, suggestions today that are related. One, it seems like the fortified roof program has been very successful, judging by the fact that it runs out of money. I'd suggest, investing some more in that. Additionally, we're hearing from both Baldwin and Mobile Association of Realtors that insurance companies are dropping coverage on houses with asbestos, Spanish tile, or aluminum roofs that are not fortified. So homeowners are out of insurance. So if you got a mortgage, you're in trouble. And I might suggest deploying some capital to alleviating the lack of coverage that homeowners are going to be experiencing over the next couple of years.
Are there any tools that exist already that municipalities can use to look at unmet needs of individual homeowners?
The short answer is no, but there's, every city, every town is different, and if there's a sophisticated database that has been set up, great. If it's spreadsheets, that's fine too, just tracking as much data points as possible. I wish I had a better answer for you. That's part of the struggle that any state faces after these disasters is the reliability and availability of good data. So, we take the data that we can get, specifically, some federal sources, insurance companies when we can get that access. But really, we kind of rely on the local communities to supply any and all information that they may have. And quite frankly, we'll accept anything we can get. We just need it documented and quantifiable, really. And if that's just, if it's a report, if it's a statement from officials, from agency representatives, whomever, we can work with that. If we have questions, we can always follow up. And for those local officials and agencies, if you want to meet with me after this, would love to exchange some information just so that I can get your contact information and see if there's any resources you can provide us to help inform the unmet needs.
I'll also add that, if we make a lot of assumptions, right? This is a data analysis effort, so we don't have exact dollar amounts on any particular, on many houses or many facilities that were damaged, and so sometimes we have to use math and apply an average amount. So to the extent that there is a significant need of homeowners or renters, if we have numbers, we can then look at maybe what the averages were for other comparable types of homes, and we can apply those and kind of target them in a little bit more. There's also data sources in terms of homeowners. Typically, the data that we have to look at, and the data that is really the most prevalent, is the FEMA IA application data. I know, and this is something that I'd put out there, and I'd like to hear your thoughts if you've had any experience with it, but I know that in particular in rural areas, FEMA, as you said, Mayor, typically undercounts or undervalues the damage, And oftentimes we'll even see FEMA decline any assistance or give 0 awards because of deferred maintenance, for example. And so you may have mobile homes, or you may have older homes that have just not been maintained because the homeowners are low income and can't afford to do it. FEMA, they may have incurred damage, but FEMA may have said that it's not damage from the storm. And so we account for that. We try as best we can to account for that in the analysis that we do. But what we do want to see whether or not they applied, because that helps us determine whether or not they believe they had damage. The other, the way that we look at it is also in terms of like geospatial mapping. We'll look at inundation areas. So if you know a particular community, for example, that was inundated with floodwater, we can look at that and then attribute a dollar amount to those as a sort of an average damage amount that we would assume from 2 or 3 feet of water or whatever it may be. So there are ways to kind of get there without specifically knowing each individual household and how much damage they incurred and how to estimate that, because that's down the road. We don't even know that right now for any houses, really, other than what FEMA has told us in their data sets. So hopefully that's helpful, and there are maybe some ways, things you could think about in terms of what information you may be able to collect.
Let me add, excuse me, sir. Let me add, Ryan, a question for you. Would a resource for the mayors and elected officials be? I know that when I was mayor and we had a disaster, we did an assessment that we coordinated with our local EMA, disaster recovery people. That EMA, particular individual, is supposed to transfer that to the state EMA. State EMA sends it up to FEMA. So I would ask that y'all look at your records, because as I can attest to, documentation is absolutely necessary for you to be able to receive or either somewhat look at being able to receive funding. So I think that would be a valuable resource because documentation is absolutely the key element here. Speaking to the lady up here that helped with the child care, I would say that you captured that through your BOAD, and that should have been relayed to EMA. EMA should have relayed that to FEMA. So that this type listening sessions hopefully will give you some ideas of where to go back to gather those sources.
I completely agree, and there are data sources that may be unique to Alabama or may be unique to your own individual municipalities or counties that you have that we might not be aware of. So part of the conversation here is to let you know the types of information we're looking for and request that if you do have additional data sources, please share them. We can incorporate a lot of this into our analysis, and it can at least inform us and help us kind of know which direction to head.
We lost all of the structures, and actually they're beyond repair. So what would that be included in this scenario?
You mentioned a particular school that was damaged?
Yeah, our church was running schools.
Okay.
They had portable structures, and they have completely been destroyed, and now they mold and set up because we were unable to repair them. So would that be included in this process?
It could be. It sounds like it could be eligible. I mean, we can't commit to any particular projects right now, right? But what we can say is that that's a type of project that could typically be funded with Cdbg funds.
So they would have to be completely replaced, or towed down? No.
It's all dependent on the specifics of the damage, and that's, you'd have damage estimators go out and take a look and determine what the best course of action would be in terms of repair replacement.
What also would be counted in that would be the access or ability to access insurance.
Correct. I mean, all of this is again, CDBG as the team had stated, it's the funding of last resort. So we're only able to fund the unmet need. So one thing that I've heard come up a lot, and maybe we can kind of go into some of these questions or kind of guided conversation topics. But one thing I've heard come up a lot is infrastructure, stormwater, drainage, so on. You know, I would ask the question: Have you all filed with FEMA for public assistance, right? And so, to the extent that infrastructure is damaged, it should be filed. You should submit a claim with FEMA for public assistance, right? That's through emergency management and so on. But that is something that would really typically have to be done before CDBG-DR can fund it, because it's something called the Order of Assistance. It's in the Stafford Act.
Mitigation plan.
Yeah, well, there are so to the extent there are other sources of funding that are available, they should be pursued. Now, there may be instances where, you know, there may be some things that you have to do in order to make your stormwater facilities more capable or resilient. Maybe repairing them to the point that they were prior to the storm, which is what FEMA does, is not going to do anything. They're just going to get destroyed again. CDBG-DR can help expand, elevate, do things that FEMA PA cannot do. But that requires a lot of coordination, requires a lot of collaboration, and a lot of documentation as well. But you have to submit your FEMA claims before we can do anything, is really what it comes down to.
But also remember, as I understood from Sean's delivery there earlier, 80% of this is set up primarily for housing. So,
Yeah, right now the snapshot of unmet needs is about 85% housing. Just quick translation, that just means the focus has got to be housing, because the unmet needs is pointing in that direction, but also housing is also a priority with HUD as well. Doesn't mean that we can't fund infrastructure and economic development projects. It just means that most of the funding will likely and could go towards housing type programs.
Right. So the Federal Register notice, which provides the rules, specifically says that funding should be proportional to your unmet needs. Right. So if you, in a terms, it doesn't have to be perfectly prorated to what the unmet needs show, but it has to be close. Otherwise, HUD is going to come back and say, no, we know that you have, because our data shows you have this much unmet need in housing. You're not addressing the unmet need in housing. HUD is a housing agency. That's their primary focus. They understand that infrastructure is obviously critical to housing, so that's why CDBG is the program that they use, as is, you know, the local economy and so on. But housing. That's where HUD is. That's where we're probably going to be headed. Primarily.
Are there any other questions?
I just wanted to add to the last question about the church, the school. As you said, with roads and bridges that may be FEMA eligible, that may be a FEMA eligible project. So that may be the first place you want to start. But as Ryan said, it is the enhancements, the improvements could be CDBG eligible as well.
Good afternoon. I'm Stacy Thomas. Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. My question is simple. Within this process, will local municipalities or governments be allowed to retain their own consultants as provided under CDBG-DR?
So it's an eligible expense. HUD's going to look at, and the state is going to look at capacity. Capacity comes in not only in consultants that you hire, but also what local resources that you have, because there's something that HUD really looks at. And we had a meeting with HUD yesterday, and they reiterated this again and again. Inherently, governmental functions have to be retained with the government. So there are certain things that a contractor cannot do. So as long as you are able to show that you have the necessary resources to be able to maintain those functions and also oversee contractors, they are generally an eligible expense as either an admin or an activity delivery expense. I think at the subrecipient level, pushing it to activity delivery, which is helpful to us. But, yes.
Anyone else? Anyone? So thank you for engaging with us at this particular point. We will be having public hearings. Shabir, if you'll take just a moment and share with these here again in September. We don't have the specific days at this point, but please let them know where those will be held.
So we're going to have a public hearing in Bay Minette. It has not been set up yet. We are in the process of setting it up. But if it happens, it will be on September 11 at 10 o'clock in the morning. And the second hearing will be the following day in Pritchard. That has been set up, and it will be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
But those dates have not been confirmed. Naturally, we will make sure that our communications department of ADECA will get that out so that you will have the time to be able to attend. We also will have the Horne team and Volkert team available to engage from that perspective. But we certainly appreciate your attendance. We appreciate hearing from you today. And if there are no other questions or comments, we'll close the listening session. Thank you for coming. Thank you.